like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Well. Hello, Internet. Today I've got a lad sitting across from me. Well, virtually sitting across from me, and he's got a twinkle in his eye. Because as I've just said to him, I've seen some of his photos. He sent them on to me. And although he was only a troop from infantry school, joined the bats, them Parabats, them, as we used to call them, vleesbommer. Please don't fight. I'm a flyboy type. Any case, he's got a twinkle in his eye. Born in the UK, believe it or not, but he thinks of himself totally as a South African. And that's what he said. I was just a South African boy like all the others. Please welcome me. Join me in welcoming here Simon Campbell-Young. And I'm going to pipe up now, and Simon can tell us his story with that twinkle in the eye, because that's what we like.
Thanks, Fossi. I really appreciate it, and thank you very much for the time. And I'm super impressed, or super happy to have the request from yourselves to come and tell, I think, what is just a normal story for a normal national serviceman, on this channel, which is such a great channel, because I think it's important to get this type of stuff down and out there and recorded, for future prosperity. So yeah, and at some point in time, maybe my grandkids can watch this. So thank you very much. I'm also highly conscious of what's come before me on this channel. I've watched a few of the series, and to be quite honest with you, there looks to me there've been some military juggernauts from a South African perspective. So truly humbled to be here. There've been some colonels and generals and Honoris Crux winners and some reconnaissance commando, 6-1 mech, chaps that fought with the Bushmen, etc., etc. So, from my humble perspective, thank you very much, because I think what's come before me has been supremely impressive. So thank you. But as you pointed out, originally English born, but our family, like some of the other crazy English, came to Africa a long time ago. Our family, while a lot, sort of South African, we sort of have slowly moved south. Originally northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and here we are in South Africa. Admittedly, some of our family that post 1980, post the formation of Zimbabwe, some of our family now live in Australia and also New Zealand, funny enough. So from a family history perspective, I would say every male member of my family was in the army. From my father, who for his sins was at 1 SSB, I joke, and then also ended up in the Bechuanaland police for many years as a young man. My grandfather was a merchant seaman. My great-grandfather was killed in the First World War. And on my mother's side, and my father's father, who I never met, was also killed in the war. And my father's brother was actually a prisoner in the Second World War. So, and then my cousins and uncles were all in the army in Rhodesia, which was a place very dear to our hearts, as a family. And I ended up marrying as a Rhodesian or Zimbabwean girl. So everything comes a full circle, actually. So, having grown up in that environment, there was just no two ways that, the army wasn't, perpetually something on my mind, or wasn't part of our family dialogue. And also having spent all that time in Rhodesia, I would say in terms of my conscious awareness period, being mentally aware of what was happening from about maybe 1972, 73, all the way up to 1980, where, I'd be up on holiday there twice a year. And, that was a country under siege, which is a fascinating, comment in itself, because, not only were they fighting a war, but they were fighting a war to protect their borders, and they were fighting an insurgency inside the extent of their borders. So it was really fascinating, for those that have never experienced that, to be able to have witnessed that, because there was such a huge emphasis on military, on pride in terms of the military, pride in terms of their boys that were serving, et cetera, et cetera. So it was just consciously always visible to me, and so hence why when it was, I knew I was going to the army. In fact, I was super excited about going to the army. In fact, I couldn't wait to get there. I remember as a young kid, my dad telling me, "Well, wait till you get your own gun." I was like, "Oh, gee, that's going to be just awesome." So a lot of that stuff. I was also at Cubs and Scouts, which was always sort of outdoors and sort of adventure orientated. And then I went to a school called King Edward's. It's an all-boys school up in Johannesburg. In fact, I think it celebrates its 120th year anniversary this year. So CARE's a fantastic institution, from a military context, just a huge emphasis on that military and that pride attached to, what the school's military ethos was. Annually we'd have our annual Armistice Day, which was largely based around, the formation of the cadets, and and then we would obviously, do the wreath laying and the march into the school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So inside CARES as well, one of the main features that sit inside the school quadrangle, which, as I say, is 120 years old, is the cenotaph, and listed on that, on that school cenotaph is, all of the boys that gave their lives in all of the wars, very specifically the Great War, the Second World War, and then obviously, South Africa's, recent border conflict, I would say, probably from about the 1960s all the way to current day. So it's a beautiful old school, huge tradition, huge ethos, huge pride in in the school, and in terms of what it represents, and who you are inside that school, in respect of what came before you. So, which also really played out for me to a large extent once I joined one parachute battalion. I was also at boarding school, which was really fantastic. And I think it also, boarding schools are a great place for young men to learn, I don't know, man management, interpersonal relationship management. All of that comes at you at quite an early age. As a prefect, and so had some levels of responsibility. Those old schools, discipline was pretty hard. It's tough and it's fair. You were pretty harshly initiated. You got caned at school, which obviously you don't these days, by the masters, by the house-masters at boarding school, and back in our day, you even got caned by the prefect. So that sort of discipline, which was harsh but fair, you kind of learn to understand very, very well. In fact, I remember a comment from one of our housemasters saying, in terms of punishment and in terms of expectation, he said, "Good boarders bunk out, bad boarders bunk out and get caught." That was just a nice, simple way of viewing the world. but yeah, you know, a lot of what I experienced, I think, from a school perspective, you know, put me in good stead. Very specifically from a military perspective, I found, just because it was nice and regimented in that in that space. I played a lot of rugby at school. You know, I played a number of years in first team, and was also fortunate enough somehow to have played rugby for Transvaal Schools. So I played 2 years of Transvaal Schools rugby, which was also, once again, a great experience, which also played out really nicely by the time you know, I got to the army, purely and simply because you know, rugby in the army was quite a thing, as was all sport. In fact, I would say rugby in the army was like war itself sometimes. I then received my my call-up papers sometime in about 1985. I think they arrived, and I remember coming home from boarding school. At that point in time, I was having such a great time at school, and I'd sort of forgotten about the army. My call-up papers had arrived. I arrived home from boarding school on the Saturday, and I saw my call-up papers there. If you recall, they used to come in that brown envelope, and I quickly put them in the drawer, and then I went outside and I saw my old man sitting in the garden reading the newspaper, and I sort of went out to him and I said, you know, I'm thinking about going to university next year, and it was available then. You could get scholarships and bursaries, and they came thick and fast if you played rugby. And I remember my father turning around and looking at me and saying, Simon, you are not university material. Brutal honesty. And he said, in fact, I think I saw your call-up papers. And so I remember looking at him, and he said, now, you're going to the army next year. And remember, we've all been in the army. And don't just go and do anything. Make sure you do something worthwhile, and make sure you do something proper. And that was his parting shot. And so what I actually did was I actually then said, right, fine, I'm going to go and become a recce, is what I decided. And in fact, one of my other friends from school, who ended up becoming an operator, a chap by the name of Craig Lepan, we then got together and said, right, and we wrote back in to apply to become to join Reconnaissance Commando, which you could do. Now I stand to correction, and there are probably some people who'll know more than me, but if I'm not mistaken, I think that might have been one of the first years, or where as a national serviceman you could sign up immediately on call up to go to the recce's. And I remember receiving another booklet or document which was full of information, and where you could do the whole application process. And then what ended up happening was I received a call up to infantry school, we then I think it was around about, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere early January, maybe the 5th or so of January. My folks took me with a crying girlfriend to Sturrock Park in Johannesburg, and we boarded what ended up being a 3-day train ride down to Oudtshoorn, which was absolutely fantastic. It was a great trip, a lot of fun and a lot of laughter. And then once we arrived in Oudtshoorn, we were off-boarded, and then we spent, I think, approximately another 5 days or so getting ourselves processed and picking up kit and getting your trommel and et cetera, all of that pandemonium that goes with those first few days of being in the army. Then I remember there was a small team of reconnaissance commandos. I'll never forget them, because they were, the first time we met them, there was, I think it was a warrant officer or a sergeant, I can't remember, and two other young guys that were with him, who addressed us in the hall, and I remember them saying, this is what's going to happen. There's going to be a pre-selection phase. And I remember him saying, look, anybody can do it. You know, just have a look at us. And I remember looking at these guys who were just looked like, to be honest, they looked like Supermen in these black t-shirts and these black pants and standing there, you know, burnt to a crisp. I remember thinking, that's really, you know, that looks incredibly cool. So they started this initial selection phase. I think there were about 200 of us that started. And then they whittled it down. I think they really only wanted about 20 or 30 people. And so really it was just an easy sort of, you know, they just basically whittled you down by just running 2,4s and making you do all various things from a fitness perspective. So, and then what happened was we were then, we had to wait for another 10, 20, 30 odd days before we were going to be moved to the next place. And in that time, rugby had started. And so I don't know how or why it started so early, but that must have been sort of early Feb, mid-Feb, and of 1986, by the way. So went to rugby practice and 1, 2, 3, you know, started to play my first rugby game, second rugby game. And, you know, it was pretty useful at the time. And then, you know, just sort of got swept up into that. I was then put into, and at this point in time, we hadn't left. I was then put into a golf company at Infantry School. And our officer commanding there was a Major Koos Hoorn, if I'm not mistaken, who was just an outstanding individual in every aspect. And in fact, I stand to correction, but I think he was also one of the founder members of the Pathfinders. He was just an excellent leader, excellent at man management, superb leadership skills, you know, just always impeccably turned out. You know, obviously he had his red beret, and he'd often wear his red jump boots as well. And he just really looked the part from a military perspective. And then he approached me and he said, listen, why don't you stay here at Infantry School? You can get your rank. I don't know, somebody might have had a word. He said, look, you can play rugby, which is quite important around here. And then when the bats come and do their selection for their leader group later in the year, I'll allow you to go and you know, see if you can make the selection. And I thought, geez, okay, that's not a bad idea. You know, and I just said, okay, great, that's exactly what I'm going to do, which I ended up doing. And if I remember correctly, staff, our company staff sergeant was Staff Collie van Sale, who was just a fantastic character, also a really, really awesome individual. You know, one of those guys that you can look up to when you're a young man, you know, who just got, you know, the right amount of humor, the right amount of discipline, you know, and the right amount of encouragement as well. So, you know, basics then at Infantry School kicks off. I think it's pretty much standard basics. I would say, you know, those basics last 3 months. And I assume the same type of basics that everyone received. You know, I don't know what other units went through, but I could summarize those first 3 months of loads of drill, loads of weaponry, loads of discipline, and loads of fitness. What was interesting was being an Englishman in an Afrikaans man's army, right? I mean, there was hundreds and thousands of English guys that went, but there was not a word of English spoken that I can remember, and that in itself, look, I understood Afrikaans. I'd done Afrikaans at high school, but geez, you needed to fast track your understanding as quick as possible. You needed to really fast track your level of acceptance or non-acceptance. You needed to really fast track your level of performance. But it sometimes was really interesting trying to understand what was going on, and quickly, and then also try to articulate yourself really quickly. I mean, the normal ridiculous things, often I try and talk Afrikaans and tell the guys what was for dinner, and say, instead of saying chicken, I'd say cake, and then, and then the guys would roll with laughter and say, Engelsman, you verkrag ons taal, and then they'd all roll with laughter, and it was actually just, I must say, I enjoyed it. I realized, very quickly, that Afrikaans English rivalry can be a lot of fun, especially when it's done with good humor, which it always was. Pretty immediately I picked up the name Soti, and bizarrely to this day, my mates that we're still friends with from infantry school wouldn't dare call me by my name and only call me Soti, which I have absolutely no issues with. But you realize very quickly with those Afrikaans boys, you either need to match them, you got to match them and beat them, or match them, and that's really is based on a couple of things. You can play rugby, you can shoot well, and you can probably match them from a fitness perspective. So that was a lot of fun, and to be really honest with you, I must say I really enjoyed that cultural diversity. It brought me a huge amount of laughter and a lot of fun. So infantry school, for those that don't or do know, it's essentially a place that you went to become an infantry leader within the SADF. All the graduate teachers and a lot of the other graduates were sent to infantry school. And generally those graduates became either 2 PIP or 1 PIP lieutenants. And then for most of us school leavers, we ended up becoming instructors or corporal, or what I think they call a platoon, or what we used to call a platoon sergeant. Straight after basics, we started doing all the various courses, which in essence were really geared towards your ability to either train the following year once you qualified, or to lead other troops into battle during your second year of service. So, I mean, it is interesting for those people that don't understand national service or never saw it or weren't part of it, but everything you did was essentially geared for war. You were being trained to go and do active service, and essentially to, I guess, put yourself in harm's way, right, for the cause. The other thing that was really interesting, and I stand to correction once again, guys, and from a memory perspective, it is quite a long time ago. But I think we were the first year where the boys from SRKK, so the South African Cape Coloured Corps, were fully integrated into infantry school, which was really interesting. And I remember our lieutenant coming to explain that to us all in the bungalow. And I remember there being quite a bit of consternation and quite a bit of dialogue, within the bungalow, which was quite amusing. But ultimately the integration went really well. There were some guys that were introduced into our bungalow, which actually ended up being a lot of fun. And there was obviously no issues. But so just, some of the things that you learned at infantry school, for those that didn't go or weren't there or didn't experience, map reading and compass work, shooting proficiency. And I would imagine that would have been for all the infantry units, but shooting proficiency, just a huge emphasis on that, including bush shooting, which essentially was something the Rhodesians called Drake shooting, which is essentially where you're shooting, but you've got both eyes open. Quick tap shooting, which is more applicable from a bush warfare perspective. Trench clearing, which we all loved, which was really fascinating. Just that process where you're going around throwing a grenade, firing down the trench, next person goes around you. All of those trench clearing maneuvers. We did attack maneuvers and attack formations, plus the control thereof. As a leader trying to move a bunch of guys into those formations. Training for night fighting, training for bush fighting, understanding camp attacks and the best methodology thereof. convoy and vehicle deployment, also really important. And then we also did a short course on civil deployment, because at the time, if you remember that period 86, in the locations and the townships, there were huge issues going on at the time, which were pretty contentious. And in fact, we were, I don't know what time of the year, we were actually deployed to the townships. I think it was mid 86, where that in itself was just was just a crazy period where, you just saw some unbelievable cruelty. But anyway, that's what it was, and that was the job at hand. We also did patrol formations, fire and movement, and obviously the buddy system, and having to control that was absolutely critical. We train over and over and over again, covering multiple iterations of fire and movement, and then also learning and understanding how to move on a fire and movement basis through different types of terrain. What was really interesting was weapons. It was really interesting. So keeping in mind, we were to be the instructors for the following year, essentially, or theoretically, we were going to be instructors. So, you had to, not only learn the weapon and be proficient at it, but you actually had to be able to teach, on that weapon. So, the understanding of, R4, I think R5, I think we might have had a couple of lessons on the R5, AK-47, Galil, the 60 mil and 81 mil mortar, the grenade launcher, or the snotneus, I think it was, as we used to fondly call it, and then Claymore, how to set up a Claymore, maximizing the kill zone, what you need to do behind the Claymore, how you set it up, where it was set up, best positioning, etc. And then also the safety around carrying that Claymore, which I'll tell you a story in a little bit, that took place the following year. And then grenades, and grenade throwing. Obviously people just assume that that's a simple thing, but there's a whole methodology behind the ability to throw a grenade. POMZ, APs, tripwires, flares, and then an RPG proficiency. And bizarrely, which it just sounds incredible now to think about, but we shot and fired all of those weapons, which I thought was incredible. Just such meticulous attention to detail training, which I remember thinking at the time is most unusual. But I think, in context, they knew they needed to get you trained. They knew they needed to get you proficient on that weaponry really early on. Another couple of things, night fighting, and control at night, the ability to be able to control, a section or a platoon at night, tracking and anti-tracking, which I thought was also fascinating, bushcraft and survival, just the little things, understanding what you can eat, what you can't eat, understanding, certain aspects of bushcraft, medical proficiency, which I thought was also interesting, dealing with wounds, and the basics around ailments that a platoon or individuals might experience, and then drill. The time we spent on that parade ground, getting it absolutely perfect and absolutely 100% was absolutely insane. And then convoy, as I said, convoy deployment, and chopper drills, M planning and D planning, where to sit, where to watch for the chopper, and if I recall correctly, how to call the chopper in, as well. And then platoon battle assessment and situational readjustments, the ability to, be in a situation and then have to be able to assess the situation and then readjust if required. And then the other thing, that really falls in the lap of a platoon sergeant is the supply, the management, and the drawing of ammunition for the platoon. food and logistics. Just absolutely simple things, right? But that fell squarely on the shoulders of the platoon sergeant to make sure that your men had enough food and that your men had enough ammo, depending on whatever it was. And then obviously man management and leadership. That was absolutely crucial. I must say, from an enjoyment perspective, there was a lot going on. But while that was happening, what was really enjoyable, I was playing rugby, and playing non-stop rugby, to be quite honest. In fact, myself and a couple of guys that were in the infantry school under 20 team, we got selected for Southwestern Districts under 20, which was really exciting. And we had a lot of fun. Obviously, we went on tour and came down to Cape Town and had a great time and played rugby. So it was a huge amount of fun. And that love of rugby in the army was just, it was really great, to be honest. So then what happens during that year, in about August of 1986, the Parabats arrived. There was a selection, I can't remember, a major and a captain, etc., and they came to infantry school to select their leader group for the following year. And I would imagine, I just can't remember because I was so hyper-focused on just the bats, but I can imagine that the other units would have come to infantry school at the same time to select their leader group for the following year. It stands to reason, right? You've got this 2-year cycle, so you've got people rotating out, so you need to bring new people into each unit. So I then obviously went for the selection. That Major Hearn had said, listen, absolutely, you need to go for it. I don't remember the selection being very difficult. I can't even remember what it was based on, but I would imagine it would have been based on fitness and suitability and possibly a recommendation from your officer commanding. I don't actually remember, but I don't think it was difficult, to be honest. So there were approximately 25 of us that were selected, and the 25 of us that were selected were candidate officers and then instructors. So those candidate officers were future lieutenants, and then obviously the rest of us that were instructors. And then very shortly after the selection, we were shipped up to Bloemfontein to one parachute battalion as a team, which was really cool, because it was a group of us. Some of us had been together in the bungalows, were then were they shipped up to one parachute battalion. As soon as we got to one parachute battalion, what was interesting, we'd only been there about 2 days when I got selected to play for one parachute battalion at the Tempe rugby tournament. So once again, it was this rugby thing, which was fantastic. And funny enough, a friend of mine that had actually played with me at school at Cravenweek, who was at one parachute battalion, was playing for the unit, knew that I was coming, and then said to, I think it was Dominique Roos, who ran the rugby, and I think Captain de Goede at the time, Mannekes de Goede, put me in the side, and we played in the Tempe Championships, which, if anybody was fortunate or unfortunate enough to play in a Tempe rugby tournament, which included one SSB, who were the sworn enemies of one parachute battalion, and one SAI, who was another sworn enemy, and one parachute battalion. It was like, I don't know, it had been like refined rugby at infantry school, but that Free State Tempe rugby was like a pack of dogs going at each other, which was unbelievable fun. But I think it was not only the rugby sides going at each other, but you were packed into that stadium at Tempe there, and I think to keep the units from going at each other was another something altogether. Anyway, we won that tournament, which was absolutely fantastic. I do remember that. It was also a great feeling. So then what happened was, everything sort of settled down. We had that leader group, a crowd of us had to wait. I think it was about 3 to 4 weeks before the first PT or the next PT course and jump course was going to start. So we spent all our days, all that time on fitness. Obviously, they were, there was a huge emphasis on making sure that as the leader group, you were fit enough to be able to get through that PD course, no problems. And then obviously the jump course. So it was fitness and prep for PD course. Plus, what was really interesting was all the conversion lessons on, parachute battalion deployment. So, it's a subtle difference from just standard infantry to paratrooper deployment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that, the small things on face value, you would obviously assume, but critical fundamentals such as landing and regrouping, advance, and obviously resupply, right? This concept of resupply and this concept of having, a clear, well thought out, well planned line of resupply to your troops that have been dropped is fundamental to to paratrooper deployment. I think one of the early movies that we were shown at the unit, in fact, we watched it twice, if I recall, was A Bridge Too Far, which is paratrooper law. That's I can't remember, Operation Market Garden, where the paratroopers were dropped to go and occupy key bridges, the most famous of which being Arnhem. Now, I'd loved that movie as a young guy. I just absolutely loved that movie. And there we were, watching this movie in the army. But it was a perfect example of paratrooper deployment, and then resupply failure, whether it's food, ammunition, support, et cetera, because you can drop and you can hold a certain certain area for only a certain amount of time. We learned the role of the pathfinders, which, to be honest, I didn't know about, but you learn and understand what that pathfinder role is and how they operated in terms of not only finding a drop zone, but being dropped into an area to set up a drop zone, to set up a landing zone, and then obviously the securitization, before before a major drop of a large scale paratrooper regiment or company has dropped. But so really interesting understanding the role of the pathfinders, and a really fantastic bunch of guys, both from a leadership perspective and then obviously from a from a troop perspective. Also, we learned about the subtle differences between a platoon structure versus a falk. So it's not called a platoon in paratrooper language; it's called a falk. Consisting of 24, which is 2 sticks, and then obviously the HQ component, which is in general 1 LT and one platoon sergeant. And then we were taught leadership requirements for a platoon sergeant, right? Well, we were the instructors, so what that role entails at a paratrooper level, which is you lead from the front. That's absolutely critical. We taught the principles of sort of maximum firepower, maximum aggression on target, and always press to danger, which was there's no skirting around. There's no skirting around in a contact. It's press to danger, max firepower on the ground, and go forward at all costs. What we were also taught was, which was really great, was we were taught paratrooper history. We taught the history of the unit, and the pride that goes with wearing the maroon beret. It's such incredible tradition, actually, and I was honestly really amazed at how proud that senior leader group was in terms of maintaining the high standards, and also certainly the high expectation. You know, it came with a lot of tradition, you know, which came with years of tradition, and you know, the South African paratroopers had obviously performed well both on the African continent and obviously abroad. And also, you know, the expectations for us as a new leader group were immense, and those expectations were very clearly articulated, both in terms of you know, being part of one parachute battalion, what it meant, and then you know, how we were to you know, how we were to portray ourselves as paratroopers, you know, in the years going, or in that following year. What was really interesting, and for any of you that might remember this individual or are ex-paratroopers, we fell as the future leader group under the control of Staff Bart, who was, and anyone who's lucky enough to have met him, you'll remember he was absolutely unforgettable. Absolutely unforgettable. I mean, everything that you would imagine by a traditional paratrooper, he just exemplified, right? He had a big twirly mustache. He, in fact, at the bottom of his browns, he wore chains, so that kept his pants hanging perfectly around the bottom of his boots, and he was immaculately dressed. So, you know, you'd hear him coming. You know, purely because as he walked, you just heard these chains go clink, clink, clink. Just unbelievable paratrooper, the deep voice and a heavy bray. You know, he used to say, "You're a trooper," but just a great man, unbelievably great man, and just a you know, someone you just looked up to. And I remember him telling us, I'll never forget this. He says, "Listen, as a paratrooper, you need to be able to run far with heavy kit, not fast. And you don't want to run fast because you need your energy for the fight ahead." I don't know. That always struck in my mind. It was interesting over that period. You know, while we were there, you know, getting ourselves ready, I remember first seeing what would be the company I would join, and was privileged enough to have joined when I you know, for my next year in the operation, which was Charlie Company, which was really great bunch of guys, and to this day just a fantastic bunch of guys who you know, we're all still in contact, obviously on WhatsApp groups and go to reunions and stuff like that. But you know, it was yeah, it was the company was coming down. They were coming down from the lines by Staff Grebe, and who, those of you who ex-paratroopers will remember Staff Grebe very well, also carried himself magnificently. A great example of a paratrooper, also immaculately dressed. And I just remember seeing this company coming down from the lines and all running in unison, red berets, you know, jump boots, you know, and singing, and you know, just exactly what you imagine. And you know, when we'd come from infantry school where drill was, you know, I don't know, you know, it was slightly more official and slightly more formal in terms of the way you gave drill. You know, I remember them sort of, you know, coming up and then Staff Grebe calling out company, halt. And then the marker shouting out, you know, not just going 1, 2, 3, 1. You know, he had this sort of just almost this like singing type of drill instruction. You know, he calls halt, and then I just hear the marker going stee, ha. And you just heard that whole company's boots come down in one hit. I thought, yeah, geez, this is the right kind of unit for me. I just remember thinking, wow, that's impressive. The other guy that was at the unit that some people might remember was RSM Landmine, who was incredibly tough and an incredibly uncompromising RSM. He's exactly what you'd expect, or what I was expecting of an RSM of one parachute battalion to be. no excuses, non-tolerance of bad form or bad behavior. And I must be honest, apart from my father, when he was angry with me, that was the only other man I think I've actually ever feared. But you're just a great man. You know, you just knew where you stood. You knew you had to manage your P's and Q's. I was so lucky to have met him a few years ago, you know, before he passed, at one of the reunions. And he was just so gracious, you know, so polite, you know, and just such a kind man. And you know, I remember chatting to him, and he just said, you know, he understood exactly what the men needed. And what the men needed was the right kind of discipline in order for them to be able to execute their tasks in the right manner. And yeah, you know, those are just such big characters. You know, specifically, you know, Staff Bart and RSM Landmine. The interesting thing, for those of you that don't know, at the BAT, there's rank, and then there's jump qualified versus not jump qualified. And there's a massive emphasis on seniority, and I'm talking about seniority in the non-ranks. And that seniority is time in the operational area, it's time in the unit, and it's jump qualified or not. And what I can tell you as a non-jump qualified and future leader group, we had plenty of tension and a number of incidents, which included quite a few fights, because, you know, you sort of this bunch of guys that, you know, your contemporaries who've actually come into the army at the same time as you, but started at the BATs as troops, know that you are coming back the next year as their leader group. So it has this underlying tension, which remains until you jump qualified. And then that sort of tension starts to dissipate. But there was a number of issues, a number of scenes, a number of punch-ups, number of warnings, etc. But ultimately, you know, you kind of understand where it's at. It was a bit like being at boarding school, right? But the intention from some of the troops, you know, some of those troops, to us as the future leader group, was to ensure that we understood our place in the pecking order, which was fine. And during that period, we started to get what anyone who's listening who's at the BATs will understand, fuss bait. And those fuss baits could get pretty severe, and in some instances were pretty brutal. And a fuss bait was quite simply, they would come in at the middle of the night, your contemporaries who were jump qualified, or, you know, one of the, you know, more senior companies that come in the middle of the night, wake you up at 1, 2, 3 in the morning, get you up. You had to stand on your trommel in front of your bed, and you had to get into parachute position, which is, you know, your arms up and your legs together, and you have to hold tight like that. And then they would just walk through the bungalow, and then you would just get you'd get a clap supposedly in your solar plexus, but obviously, and they would just anyway, it was tradition, and it was great, because it's just the way it's supposed to be. And I'm assuming it had gone on for many years, but you know, I mean, it was, you know, it's a sort of harsh justice and harsh expectation and harsh way of making sure that you understood your you know, your pecking order. So eventually, you know, we started our PD course, which, for those of you that don't know, is 2 weeks of hell. It's designed to weed out the weakest link. Ultimately, you know, they just want to get the right guys through. And essentially, it's all-day fitness classes. It's broken up into different disciplines. It's buddy PT, marble PT, which can really push you mentally, carrying that marble around. You know, you got to hold it in two arms. It's hard to carry. It's angular. and it can, it can exhaust the best of them. Log runs, obstacle courses with loads of height orientation. That obstacle course at height also quickly removes the weak links. And then milling, or the boxing, I think the English call it milling actually, but boxing, where you'd box each other. And that's also designed, to assess and to monitor sort of controlled aggression. Plenty of 2,4s. And then finally, I think on the very last Saturday, if I'm not mistaken, is the 21 kilometers, with that big gun pole. There's 4 per pole, and you're swapping positions all the time. And to be honest, that of all the things that I think I found heavy going, it was that Saturday with that 21K with the pole, because it could kind of break you a little bit, because if you've got a weak link and someone isn't carrying, you've got to just continue to run, continue to carry. So it does create quite a bit of pressure, and that's what they want. They want you under pressure, they want you tired, and they want you to push through, which is understandable. The other thing is everything's timed. Everything is meticulously timed. Everything's meticulously run. And so every exercise that you do, the obstacle course or the runs or the poles or the whatever it is, it's all timed. You've got to start and finish at a certain time, and if you don't make those times, you're getting kicked off. It's that simple. They really want only the cream to be able to go on to the next phase. And so at the end of the PD course, we started the jump course. And the jump course lasts about 4 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, if memory serves me right. And the initial period of the jump course is really around all the drills and loads of drill inside the hangar, right? And those hangar drills are, learning how to exit the plane, learning your drills on parachute deployment. In other words, what you do once your chute deploys. What to do in the event of a malfunction, how and when to pull your emergency chute, how to fold and not necessarily repack your chute for deployment, but how to pack your chute, get it on your back, and then get moving on landing. How to assess for wind and wind direction, how to, what to look at on the ground, etc., etc. Because bearing in mind, we were jumping with steerables at the time. The steerables have just got that, that open section at the back, which, if I'm not mistaken, has got just a standard forward movement of 5 knots. So logically, as you deploy, that chute is starting to move forward at 5 knots. So, if you've got a 10-knot wind behind you, you're now moving at 15 knots. So the trick is always to assess for wind, see where you are, know where your drop zone is, turn into the wind to try and negate whatever wind there is, and then try and come down. And keeping in mind, you're jumping with those pumpkin or pumpoon chutes, and all they've got is it's not as if you've got toggles like on a free fall. You've just got your 2 primary lift waves, so which you pull left, sort of turns, and you pull right, it sort of turns. So yeah. And then also, drills like how to get into your chute, how to clip in, on the ground, plus all of those safety check procedures, how to enter an aircraft, both the Dakota and then obviously the C-130, how to shuffle to the door, that whole process of getting that entire company or folk to the door and then exiting the door. I'm sure you guys have seen, or those of you that aren't, that whole shuffle process to the door, which is I think primarily it's quite traditional, and then how to stand in the door, that exit procedure, if you're first out the door or you're coming up to that exit out the door is crucial to what your parachute deployment is going to look like. If you get out the door late-ish and just the front part of your body goes first out the door as opposed to a good exit, as your chute deploys, you can obviously be spinning, and then you've got you've got loads of you spend your time trying to untangle before you can actually start focusing. So that exit out the door was really key. That process of standing up, and then what happens from a check procedure inside the plane, because I think essentially you checking the man in front of you's kit, and you checking the man in front of you that he's got his strop hooked up, so there's just a, a level of responsibility, and then obviously understanding, red light, green light, et cetera, et cetera. Out of interest, what I thought was really interesting, the first time you finished your ground drills before your first jump. I'm not sure whether they did this forever or pre us, but our first time in the plane, fully kitted up, we were taken up in the Dakotas, and obviously in Falk strength. And then what you did was you went through that whole pre-jump procedure, stand up, hook up, check, shuffle to the door. And then as each person got to the door, there were two dispatchers on either side. And then what they would do is they would hold you and then push your head out the door of the plane. Obviously, you're flying, and they'd push your head out the door, and then they'd make you look up the fuselage, to the wing, and to where the cockpit was, just for orientation purposes. They make you look down, and then they'd make you look, to the tail of the plane to show you where you're going to go out, and how you slide out under this, which I thought that was really interesting. And what they do is they bring you back in, turn you around, and you go back and sit down, and they bring the next guy. So finally, you get to do your first jump, which was just a supreme experience, unbelievable experience. I mean, honestly, I can remember it if it was yesterday, and I'm sure any paratrooper will tell you the same. Most paratroopers can remember their first jump. I think I'd say it's a little bit like the first time you had sex. You won't forget it, right? It's right up there. The birth of your kids and your wedding, maybe they're all in that area, right? So as I recall, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I didn't recheck my old logbook, but I think we qualified on 9 jumps, which included a night jump, jump out of a C-130 out the side doors, a tailgate jump, which is out of the C1 as well. You've seen where they lower the tailgate and then you walk off the back, and a full kit jump. Okay, when I say full kit, I mean your full kit is with your rucksack and rifle, and the procedure for that, by the way, is which is quite interesting. Your full kit, your rucksack essentially is attached to you by 2 hooks. So they're quick release hooks that are attached to your kit bag, and there's a 14-foot rope that is attached to your harness, which is then attached to the bag at the same time. It's a hell of a thing getting into the plane with your full kit. It's a hell of a thing getting to the door with your full kit to make that exit. And it's always a tricky exit with full kit. But the trick is, as you go out the door, you're holding onto the bag in front of you like that, your kit bag in front of you like that. The chute deploys, you steady off, and then immediately you push the 2 quick release hooking mechanism, and your kit bag then falls attached to the 14-foot rope, and it drops below you. So you have this initial jolt, and then your kit bag is below you. I'm sure you've seen it a million times. And then what happens is then you come down. It's your chute, it's yourself, and then your kit bag 14 foot below. The trick with the full kit jump is that kit bag generally starts to move, and then you start to oscillate, which sometimes can make for fascinating landings, because you can sort of come in like that, bag so it's always quite interesting. The other thing is, on all of those qualification jumps, what's happening is the instructors are on the ground and they've got a loud hailer system. And as you coming down, they're calling out to you, good, bad, don't forget X, Y, Z, you know, kick into your strap, check your chute. And so they're calling out, so they're watching you, which you know, and obviously mistakes are not tolerated at all. You know, if you're making mistakes on exit, if you're making mistakes on your parachute drills on the way down, if you're making a mistake on your landing, all of that stuff, it's just not tolerated, right? Which is fascinating in itself, just because of the you know, the hyper detail that's put into training, into training you. I always thought that was quite interesting. Then on your final jump, which is essentially the wings parade, where you are then awarded your wings. Your parents and family and friends are invited to the wings parade, which then obviously includes your last jump at the airfield. You know, it's a great day, and it's beautifully orchestrated and well run, and it's a huge day just from a pride and excitement perspective, because what's happening is you're at the airfield, you coming over, you jumping, and as you jumping, they're calling out your name so that your parents or family or can see you coming out the plane, which I think is which I thought was great, to be honest. And then getting your wings pin on your chest, it's just a magnificent feeling. You know, I can also remember the day. I can remember it as if it was yesterday. So it's also great pride, you know, great sense of achievement, and also then belonging to the unit, and especially a sense of belonging to, I guess, you know, paratrooper brotherhood. You know, as cheesy as that may sound, but that was important. And then also a sense of belonging to that bunch of guys, you know, that you'd kind of walked a long journey with, right? You know, you'd sort of infantry school all the way, selection, and then now, you know, as the future leader group, you know, you've got your wings. So pretty soon after that, you know, we finish up. I think it was one or two more courses. Immediately after that, we then sent back to infantry school. As that leader group, we sent back to infantry school to go and do our last course, which, if I remember correctly, was called, in fact, I only know the Afrikaans word, bizarrely, methodiek. That must be methodology, right? I guess, which was a pretty relaxing course. To be honest, I don't really even remember it. And funny enough, while we as that group were at one parachute battalion, our you know, our colleagues that had stayed behind had actually done a 5-week deployment to the border. I think it's sort of a soft phase border deployment. I think it's I don't think it's in a really dangerous area, but they had their first deployment to the border. Then what you do is you spend a couple of weeks getting ready. It's all about the pass out parade, and at the pass out parade you receive your full rank finally, which was fantastic. And again, another great event. All family and friends are invited down, and then there's a huge military display. For those of you that know infantry school, I can't remember, you know, at the back of the infantry school there was all the battlegrounds, etc., because they're magnificent weaponry and machinery that a lot of guys were trained on at infantry school. And there was a full demo. You know, they had you know, the guys with the anti-tank and the anti-aircraft missiles and tanks. It was an absolutely fantastic day. We finished at infantry school around about the 5th of December, 1986. And you know, pass out parade, etc. You then are obviously given your formal orders, which is where you need to report to immediately thereafter. You know, we obviously knew where we were going. I think maybe some guys at that point in time are either told they're staying behind to be instructors at infantry school, or they're going to other units, etc. I don't quite remember and understand. To be honest, I think I was just hyper focused on getting to where I needed to be. So we finished on the 5th. I think we needed to be back at 1 parachute battalion by the 8th of December. So you don't get, there was no leave, there was no pass or anything. You finish. I think we had a lekker opskop in Oudtshoorn that night or something along those lines. And I remember getting into my my blue Mazda 323 and hauling it up to Bloem. The minute you get up there, we were settled into our NCO barracks, which was obviously at Tempe at the battalion. And we drew the necessary kit. I think the first things we all wanted was our maroon berets and our jump boots. That was critical, which we all got. And then obviously we were then assigned to the companies we would be working with for the following year. I was really wanting to get into an operational company. I wanted to go to the border, and I was fortunate enough, both then and to this day, to have been put into Charlie Company, which was an operational company for the following year. Funny enough, they weren't there at camp. They happened to be out on an exercise or out on maneuvers or whatever it was, a retraining or training exercise up at 44 Battalion, which was up or beyond. It was up north, somewhere north of Pretoria, up near or in the Waterberg, I think. To be honest, I can't remember exactly where it was, but I think there were 6 of us that were joining Charlie Company with 2 or 3 instructors, 3 or 4 instructors and 3 instructors, 3 luties that would be joining, or 4 of each. I can't remember, but off we went, and we were flown up there. And I remember we were dropped off somewhere in the bush at about 6 o'clock at night, and it was pouring with rain. I'll never forget it. And we were met by, I don't know who it was, who said, right, grab your kit and follow me. And off we went to go and find our respective respective company or companies. I remember we walked for about 3 hours in the pouring rain in the middle of the night, and eventually got to the TB where the company was, and I met up with then Charlie Company, and I was introduced to Major Scully van der Walt, and obviously then to Staff Gruber. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was either a Lutie or a Captain, Stephen Duplessis. Also a fantastic leader group. Major van der Walt was also traditional, old school, by the book, paratrooper, didn't tolerate nonsense, and a good guy, and to this day, still a good guy. In fact, he was a major then, but he's now, I think he finished up as a colonel, because I see we still call him colonel on the WhatsApp group. But also met Staff Gruber formerly, who sort of ran us as NCOs, and then Captain Stephen Duplessis, who was a real professional. And then that night, I was introduced to my new Falk. It might have been, I think, 12 or 1 o'clock, 12 at night or 1 o'clock in the morning. You were then taken straight through to be introduced to your new Falk. They'd been out on maneuvers all day, and I remember going into the tent. Now, if you understand that rotation process that we talked about earlier, the old leader group they sitting now with, I don't know, 10, 15 days to go. They dying to hand over to you and get out of there. And so I remember walking in, and then, there's, I don't know, it's 20 guys or whatever it was. And they go, the old platoon sergeant said, this is Corporal Young. He used to call me, they never called me by my full name. I always had Young on my, in fact, I was known as Corporal Young for some reason. No one ever called me by my full name. I remember, in fact, at infantry school, someone said that's way too long to put on your your name tag. We're just going to call you Young. Anyway, so they introduced me as Corporal Young, and there you are. You actually just qualified, and then there you are in front of your new troops who, obviously I'd seen and known and played sport with some of them, during that period that we were at the battalion, getting our jump qualifications. But I remember it just being a bizarre experience, because it's just so quick. A few days ago you were a troop, and now you've got your 24 guys. Or 20 guys that you're going to sort of run and manage, and I thought, oh geez, I just got to get out of here as quick as possible, hello, and then I remember, they're all sitting there, on their beds, like watching, waiting, and then I thought, oh, can I get out of here? And then I remember one of the guys going, he said it in Afrikaans, so has the corporal not got something on his heart that he'd like to say to us? And anyway, I mean, I don't know. I just said something light and said, "Listen, guys, we're all here. Let's have a good time. We're going to be together, and I'm really here to have a good time. I'm super happy to be with you." And it's kind of what we went from there. So then, I'm just going to take you through now, because I've got quite a few dates and timelines on what was actually a very busy year from an operational perspective, which also talks, quite a bit in a little bit of detail around Ops Firewood, and then takes you through a whole bunch of the operational stuff that we did throughout that year. And I just want to say a big thank you to Andrew Leese. If you do listen to this, Andrew was one of my section leaders who was an unbelievable section leader and is to this day just an absolutely fantastic adult human being. And Andrew was meticulous as a section leader, and meticulous as the guy who keeps our group together, funny enough. Started the WhatsApp group, and as the driving force behind all of us being together. And Andrew kept detailed notes during that period that we were operational for that period. So we came back from that exercise. We got back to Bloem around about the 18th of December, 86. We thought, oh, fantastic. Back on the 18th, definitely we're going to have pass for Christmas and New Year. Everyone was, pretty excited about it. And on the 19th, we were told, get ready for deployment. You are leaving tomorrow morning for Messina, which we left, the morning of the 20th. Boom, we were up to Messina. And in fact, we ended up spending from the 20th of December right up until the 5th of January, deployed on the Limpopo River. So we got into Messina, and then we were redeployed from there. And we were deployed as 5-man observation and listening teams, spread out, I think 2 to 5 kilometers apart. And we were deployed from Bite Bridge all the way down towards Mozambique, which was really interesting. For a number of reasons. It was kind of bittersweet. I'd been in and out of Rhodesia all my life, and crossed Bite Bridge a million times, right? And even during the war, so it was quite a bizarre thing. In fact, for those of you that might or might not remember, back in the day, during the 70s, when the Bush War was going on in Rhodesia, if you were going in, you got to Bite Bridge, and you had to join a convoy, because at the time, the Terrors were attacking convoys. So they would attack, tourists or trucks or people traveling, in between Salisbury and Vic Falls and Bandura and Bulawayo and, wherever it was where people were going, they were being attacked on the road. So when we used to leave, by the way, just for posterity's sake and as a segue, we were living in Johannesburg at the time, and then we'd be going up, I don't know, for Christmas or something along those lines, up to the family. Then we'd have to get up at, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the morning, and then we'd have to jump in the car, and then we'd race like mad to Beitbridge to catch the first convoy that was leaving at the time. And if any of you ever caught on this channel, if you ever caught those convoys, what they had a lead vehicle with maybe a 5.0 Browning mounted onto a bucky or a noddy car, and then they had a vehicle in the middle with another Browning, and then they had one at the back, and then all the tourist cars would fit in between that, and then you'd race all the way up to Salisbury or to Bulawayo or wherever it was. And invariably, we'd get there late. My mom and, I don't know, you know what it's like, those trips, leaving early in the morning with dogs, and this is, anyway, and then we'd get to Beitbridge, and we'd go through the South African side, we'd get to the other side, and the Rhodesian guys would say, geez, the convoy left 40 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, whatever. We'd be like, because then you had to wait for the afternoon. And always, my old man would say the same thing. When I was telling my kids this a little while ago, they couldn't believe it. So what my old man would do is he'd say, right, okay, we'll go. And then the Rhodesian guys would say, look, we don't advise it, but it's your call. And then my old man would say, right, get into the back, put the duvet over your head, and then in that Peugeot 504, then he'd just belt it, to hopefully try and catch the convoy an hour later or whatever the case may be. Which, if you think about it in today's context, you just wouldn't do that with your kids. I don't know, maybe you would, but and then often enough, my old man would stop because the Mapani worms, I don't know if there's any roadies on you, but those Mapani worms crawl across the road. They're those big fat worms that if you fry them up, they taste like peanut butter. Then he'd stop the car, and then he'd say, get out, go and collect the Mapani worms. My mom's sitting with the shotgun. It's just, if I think about it now, it's just crazy. But so anyway, we were deployed onto the Limpopo, which was really beautiful to be there. It was quite an experience, to be quite honest. We'd go down to the water. The river hadn't come down in flood yet, so it was a dry riverbed with a lot of rivulets and still running, which in itself was incredible, because the game that would come down to drink that you could see on the riverbed was just incredible. I don't know, to be honest, what the role was. I don't know whether people were coming over and attacking farms. I don't know whether we were busy with a deployment across there at the time. I don't know what it was and why we were there, but that's what we did. Eventually, in and around just before New Year's Eve, the rain started coming down, and it started coming down and coming down. You know what it's like, those northern Transvaal thunderstorms, and when it just rains and rains and rains and rains and rains. So we had been camped. I'd initially camped the guys down at the bottom near the riverbed, and I remember waking up one night in the rain, and I was looking at the water, and I just started to see, I could see that the water level had started to rise. And I remember waking up the guys and saying, listen, chaps, come, we need to get out of here. And then we packed up all our kit, and then we pushed our way up onto a little koppie that overlooked, which was ultimately a better place to be. And then we could oversee the river. And honestly, I've never seen that in my life before, and I've never seen it again to date. But to see that Limpopo River come down in flood, when that headwater comes down, it's a torrent of water that's just coming down and just engulfed where we were sitting within seconds. But it comes down like a wave and carrying everything in front of it. And it was full moon that evening. It was a sight to see. I mean, you pay money these days to see that kind of thing, right? We were getting it for free. So, as I said, we were there until the 5th of Jan. and then we got back to the unit around about the 9th of January. And then actually they gave us leave from the 10th to the 14th, which was really, really nice. What I do remember about that, there was an incident on the train with the guys coming back from leave, and there was some seriously bad behavior, and a bunch of the guys that were on the train down from Johannesburg were fined 30 Rand each for riotous behavior, was the term. And I remember Major Scully being highly upset about that. Then we were, pretty shortly after that, we were told to get ready for deployment. And on, I think around about the 18th, 19th, 20th of January, we were deployed to, flown up to Rundu. I think we got to Rundu on about the 18th. And then the very next day, we were on the road out to Napara, and then on to Omaoni, which we all termed Miami. I remember preoccupying the camp at Omaoni, which was where our HQ was to be. We had to sleep outside because there were a bunch of 6i had occupied the camp at the time, and they were expected to withdraw the next day. So we all slept outside. And then the other units that were actually in camp, there was some guys from 3si, Esakaka, and a couple of chaps from 3-2 battalion. The very next day, we then did a logistics and a drop-off run down the cut line to the Fox bases. That's all I can remember. So there was 3 Fox bases: Hotel Fox, Lima Fox, and X-Ray Fox. And then we were dropped off. Myself and my section were dropped off. I think it was Hotel Fox. It was the most western extremity of the Fox bases. We were left there as there were a report of some tours in the area, and then the rest of the crew stayed at Omaoni. And then they then repopulated those Fox bases shortly after that. The rest of the guys were operating also as a reaction force and a logistics hub. Those Fox bases, and there's probably some guys that were permanent force that can understand or know a lot more than I do, but I think they were essentially sort of defense and patrol bases on the cut line. They weren't formal bases in terms of well structure and large scale defense systems. They were actually just, they were bunkers, with massive sandbags, and then, with a sort of a defensive perimeter for maximum efficiency, I would guess. At the Fox base that we were at, there was a crew of sappers that were at Hotel Fox that we joined, that were due to be rotated out about 10 days later. They'd been there for a while. It was great for them to show us the ropes, etc., etc. And they ended up actually being extracted because a couple of days or a week after we arrived, they had a contact. And it was, I guess an innocuous event, but what had actually happened, I guess they were lucky to get away with it. But what had happened was they'd gone down to have a look at a shona that was actually, have a look at a kraal that was in a shona. And if I've got the story right, there were 2 injuries. One guy was shot running for cover through the sole into his foot, and the other guy was shot in the foot because he had stayed in the TB where the guys had set up before they went to go and have a look at the kraal. He'd stayed inside the TB and he was lying on his back reading his book with his foot up, and the Turs had set up behind, and when they were shooting down, the foot that was up had got shot. It's just just a bizarre incident, right? So we were at those bases for for quite a while. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, all the way right up to mid-March. The other interesting thing that happened while we were there, we were sent a ComOps lieutenant, and for a while, for a couple of weeks, we had to escort the ComOps lieutie to go and, I don't know, he was, we had to go around to escort him around to all of these kraals, and he'd patrol with us a little bit, and then he would go and sit and ask information. I don't think it was intelligence gathering. I think it was more information about, what the civil populace was made up of, et cetera, in the region. But basically what happened over that period, from mid-Jan to sort of towards the end of March, it's just patrolling. So 4 to 6 day patrols with 2 days off. Obviously, for once again, for those that were in that area, you know what that's like. It's just heavy sand. And so, sometimes that patrolling could be quite exhausting. I mean, by 11 a.m., the heat was unbearable. We weren't carrying that heavy, it's just radio, rat packs, and ammo. So you could get up to, if I remember correctly, you could make up to about 18 Ks a day on foot on patrolling. But what I do remember, the flies and the muggies could just drive you insane. The minute you stop, those muggies were up your nose, in your ears. It was crazy, right? In fact, the best thing to be to defend off muggies was a smoker. I wasn't, but I remember sometimes going to sit next to a smoker, just to keep the muggies away from you. Mostly we were looking for spoor, following up on intel, et cetera. What was really interesting, which is typical paratrooper stuff, I remember Captain Duplessis was with us for a while, and he made us do PT every day, every single day. We'd run out that base, chest webbing, rifle, and he'd make us do a 2,4, whatever it was. It didn't matter if there was a danger around or not. We ran, which I always thought was quite interesting. We had regular supplies from Omani, and here's the efficiency of that South African Defence Force. We got our pay, not our full pay, but apparently our danger pay was drawn in Rundu and was brought back out to Omani and then was delivered to us at the Fox bases. I mean, $56 is what that danger pay amount was. I mean, that's just outstanding logistics and coordination and just brutal efficiency. And we'd obviously buy a cool drink at a cooker shop and stuff like that, which was, I remember at the time, a couple of our troops were sent up to 102 Battalion in the Krugerveld for training. And also just managing those bases it was bunkers, right? So you were permanently digging, filling sandbags, trying to keep these bunkers in decent order. There was just a couple of notable events that happened during that bush trip. There was a ComOps patrol in the area that hit a contact with 10 tours. The patrol scattered. One man got injured in the leg. I know the guys at Omani, they were told to prepare and act and push out as a fire force, et cetera. There was another incident where I think some of the SA Infantry guys had hit a POMZ, et cetera. Just little bits of incidents. One of our sections at one of the other Fox bases caught 4 tours, which is quite amazing. How they caught them, I don't really remember, but there was reports of about 30-odd group of about 30 tours in the area, is what we were told. And then how's this for crazy? Around about towards the end of February, about the 22nd, I think it was, I was notified that I needed to report to Rundu, along with 3 other guys who were all rugby players that we'd also played. So on our way back, we said, okay, great, super, no problem. And on our way back, we passed through Omani to go and see the major. And the major said, congrats, you guys have been invited to Free State rugby trials. Now we're sitting on the cut line, of Angola. And, that was just unbelievable. The best part, there we were, now being shipped off to go and do Free State under 20 rugby trials, so we were absolutely dumbfounded. Anyway, got to Rundu, got there late at night, I remember, I think they used to shoot fire plans, the G5 cannons. I just remember waking up in the night and just hearing these blasts going off. No, what the hell it was. But anyway, the next day was a sports parade at Rundu, right? And there was a rugby game. And we were supposed to fly back. And somebody said, no, you guys aren't flying. You guys are playing rugby for us today, which we then ended up, we said, we got nothing. Anyway, we ran on with Takis, played a great game. And then we left the next day for Bloem, right? So I think that was, we left on about the 24th of Feb, arrived at 1 Parachute Battalion on the 25th. First person I bump into is RSM Landmine, who saw me and said, right, bring the guys. The 4 of you, bring your troops. The 4 of you need to come with me. We're going to go and burn fire breaks at De Brugge. We spent from the morning until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon in that heat, burning fire breaks. Okay, and I mentioned to RSM Land, I said, by the way, RSM, we've, the rugby trials that he said, don't worry, everything's fine. You guys will be perfect. Anyway, we then ended up having to go and play the trials at the Free State Stadium that night. And the 4 of us, I remember, I couldn't even run. You're just exhausted, burnt. But RSM London, it was Army first and everything else comes second, which was to be expected, really. We spent the next day in the camp on the 26th, and on the 27th, we were flown back up to the operational area, all the way from the cut line, all the way down, trials, back up again. I mean, it's incredible. I often say to people, ask me about South African Army, rugby, God, and war. And I'm not sure which order, but that's sometimes what it felt like, right? Well, for me personally, because there was a high degree of religion within that army structure, and which is really, which was obviously always prevalent. I remember, just a couple of incidences once we were back up there. We then left that operational area. We left Omani around about the 16th of March, and then we flew back to Bloemfontein around about the 19th of March then, and then we were actually given a 16-day pass, which was really great, and etc. We all got back on pass around about the 6th of April, and then I remember around about the 7th or 8th of April, Charlie Company gave a junior company a fussbait, which everyone turned a blind eye, but the guys got into quite a bit of, I don't know why, but they got into quite a bit of trouble for that. I do remember that, and in fact, a bunch of guys were actually court-martialed, so to speak, but got a 14-day suspended sentence. So in other words, don't fussbait. You're not supposed to. Well done on the fussbait. There's your suspended sentence, which was great. Then, just quick turnaround again. We then received orders, and on the 14th of April, we were flown straight back up to Ondangwa. That Ondangwa flight was about 3.5 hours. And for those that didn't fly into Ondangwa, and for those that did, you'll remember what was interesting about that flight, specifically on those floorsies, to lose and gain altitude. They spiraled down and up over the base. It wasn't a long takeoff and so on and so forth. It was really short, obviously from a danger perspective, just to get the plane up and get it down as quick as possible. I do remember that, and then from very quickly thereafter, from about the 18th of April, we were running patrols. It was primarily around the Etali area, and then running base patrols out of Ondangwa. Just a couple of memorable events. We had a couple of near misses in terms of we were supposed to get involved in a camp attack with the Rekis, flown out to Oshakati and then out to Ruakana, we're supposed to rev a small base near Zangongo. That never happened. You know, you could sense, you know, as troops and all of us, everyone was right. Okay, when are we going to fight, or when are we going to go and see some action? I think that was obviously, you know, just on to, you know, it was on everybody's mind. The other thing we did starting around about the 6th of May was lunar ops. You know, lunar ops, yeah, you'll know lunar ops, right, Forsey? So lunar ops, for those that don't know, take place over the full moon period. You know, that's when there's most visibility in the bush. And, you know, you sent up and you circle around. I think there's a gunship flying as well, if I'm not mistaken. Two gunships flying and one DAC loaded with paratroopers. And what they're doing is they're looking for infiltration coming in over that full moon period. If they see it, you called and they drop you much the same as the old Rhodesian fire force. They drop you onto the enemy or into a stop group structure, whatever that might be. So that was quite a bit of fun. I think we had a no action on our first lunar op. We did, and in fact, it was great because, you know, what they would often do is then they would just drop us instead of re-landing with us. They'd drop us over the airfield. And if I remember that night, we were dropped at about 2,500 foot, which was fantastic because at 2,500 on a steerable, you're getting about 2 minutes in the air to float and come down, which was great. Yeah, which was absolutely fantastic. I remember around about the 10th of May, we did another lunar op and sat in a holding pattern for, I don't know, 2 to 3 hours, just flying round and round and round, and just insane turbulence, you know, because that heat's coming off the ground and it's just making that Dakota just wobble. And obviously, yeah, I mean, if you know what it's like, when you're sitting there and you're strapped up, it's so confined and it's so hot because you've got your kit on. And the minute one guy starts to vomit, then it becomes an event. And so eventually you're sitting in this plane that's just, it's terrible. Anyway, that night, I think they dropped us out again. They dropped us on the runway at about 11 o'clock at night. Interestingly, on the 17th of May, and I'm just checking, I had a look at Andrew's notes, on the 17th of May, 1987, Ondangwa itself was revved. I'm not sure if that was a regular occurrence, but I do remember that 17th of May, or Andrews in his notes has noted it. I think there was about 8 mortars that fell. They revved Ondangwa town that night. We kind of started to get the sense that something was brewing. I remember, I don't know whether it was normal procedure, but everyone with an O-neg blood type was asked to donate for some strange reason. I don't know why O-neg, but we just sort of thought that something was brewing. And then, you know, obviously just continuing with patrols. On about the 26th of May, we flew back up to Rundu, which, if you know what that flight to Rundu was like on a Dakota, it took about an hour and a half, right, in a DAC. And that first half an hour was at about 20 or 30 meters above the ground, okay? You flew contour. It felt like you were going around the trees, right? It was, you know, and then an hour at about 1,000 foot. It was, you know, if you got airsick, it was an absolute dog show for you. Anyway, we arrived. We were put up at Fort Foote actually, and our role was to provide search and rescue for the pathfinders who had been out. We got back to Ondangwa around about the 29th of May, and there was now talk of Ops Pineapple, which I thought didn't go ahead, but after speaking to a really good friend of mine, Chris Sneyman, who was with 101, I think that did go ahead, but here's what was interesting, right? Everyone wanted to go on Ops Pineapple, everyone. And so the major had said, right, there was a 2,4, and the first 40 or so people on the 2,4 get to go. It is that simple. I mean, it is a race like mad. And I think that Ops Pineapple, the mission there was to stop the Far East detachment of SWAPO from withdrawing deeper back into Angola, if I remember correctly. The mission was we were going to be dropped about 200 kilometers into Angola, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Around about the 30th of May, you know, we got orders, drew ammo. I think there were about 60 paratroopers from Charlie Company, Bravo Company, and Delta Company, plus the 101 guys. So it's approximately 1,000 troops. You know, we did some retraining drills on the C-130, which was where we were going to get pushed out of. We actually shot weapons in. It was going to be a night jump at 1,000 foot, you know, which you think is relatively low, but actually really isn't. If you consider, just by the way, if you look at what those Rhodesians were doing, specifically the RLI, you know, they used to jump at 300 to 500 foot on Fire Force, which is just crazy. But you know, you're immediately on target, or you're immediately into stop group. It was a full kit. It was a full kit jump as well. And then I think D-Day was Tuesday the 2nd. We found out that our involvement in Ops Pineapple had been aborted because of a threat of an air attack. You can imagine, you know, you've got a bunch of troops fully psyched, fully good, ready to go, and everyone's now, right, I need to get to war, I need to see war, I need to shoot this rifle, and it's just, you know, you're like a pack of wolves, for want of a better term. Anyway, you know, we were told to stand down, and then, you know, just continued patrolling between most of June, operating in and around Etali, Beacon 18 and 19, setting up a few ambushes, but actually very little SWAPO and very little water is what I do remember. Around about 20th of June that year, you know, things were starting to hot up. You could get a sense of it. There were 2 folks of ours that were sent up into Angola. We were operating, if I'm not mistaken, just north of Santa Clara, which I can't remember how far Santa Clara was in, but I think it was only maybe 50, 40. I can't remember how far it was into Angola. For those of you that ever went through Santa Clara, I remember, you know, looking at that and thinking, wow, that must have been a nice little village. You know, it was beautifully set out. You know, you could see where the town square was. You could see where the town fountain or water pump. It must have been magnificent country, you know, back in the day. Around about the 6th of July, after that running around in Santa Clara, we were then we escorted a bunch of recce's into Angola. We escorted them up by vehicle. We dropped them off, I can't remember where, but it was about 60 odd kilometers inside Angola. Dropped them off, and then we headed back, and then we exited out at Oshikati. On about 8th of July, we were deployed to Rio Kana. And there, what was interesting there, we were deployed to the Kunene River. And we were deployed on the Angolan side of the Kunene River. Once again, in OPs and observation posts, so 4, 5-man, 6-man teams, you know, spread out about 5 kilometers, which, you know, was interesting to be deployed on that side of the river. Obviously in an offensive capacity, but wow, you know, what I can say about most of Angola when I was there and even further up, which I'll get to now, was, you know, I remember just thinking at the time, I cannot wait to get back here as a tourist or drive around or have a look at, and fortunately I've been able to, you know, to do that in later life. But, you know, that Kunene River area is quite something. There's no doubt about it. We'd get resupplied. So we were there for quite a while. We were there from the 8th of July up until about the 23rd of July. We were in that area operating, you know, to be honest, it wasn't the hardcore stuff, but you know, that was the task. That was the task at hand. Round about on the 23rd, we were then uplifted back to Ruakana and then back to Ondangwa. As we got back to Ondangwa, I remember the major told us that we are going to be involved in a army exercise at Luatla, which was really interesting, right? So at Luatla Army Battle School, right? And then after that, they were going to give us a pass. So we were, wow, that came up, you know, just came out of nowhere. So we flew back to Bloem around about 29th, and then started a little bit of retraining because that Luatla jump was going to be a night jump, which, you know, if you're fortunate enough to be involved in one of those events at Luatla, it's quite a scene, and it's you don't know what's going on, to be quite honest with you. I mean, clearly, you know, you're not 100% sure you focused on just what you've got to do for that, but I would imagine understanding the bigger picture, you know, in terms of the battle game that was being played out, you know, would be fascinating. But our role was a night jump out of the C1, and I remember that very specifically, being first out the door. You know, once again, into the pitch black, which is always interesting, going out the door into the pitch black. I just remember getting ready, standing in the door, and the dispatcher breaking a Lumi stick, chucking the Lumi stick into the back of my helmet. So as you're going down, you're the marker, and everybody follows you in terms of where you need to land. We had a great jump, landed. I think we shot at nothing, but that was our role, right? And it was great because, you know, I remember we lay back and just watched this war zone go on above us, just rounds and explosions, and it was quite a scene. It was a hell of a sight. Other thing I remember about that, just by the way, and I'm sure all the guys that were together on that will remember this. It was -5 degrees. And we jumped just with our jump jackets, you know, and our rifles, you know, and our webbing, no kit, no sleeping bag, no nothing. And we landed, did our bit, and then waited and waited and waited. And it was freezing. Eventually I said to the guys, listen, we made fires and lay there hugging each other around those fires at -5 degrees. I can remember that night also as if it was yesterday. In fact, I burnt a big hole in my jump jacket by rolling into the fire while I was sleeping. It was so cold. Anyway, that was August done. They gave us pass. They gave us a nice big fat pass, which was fantastic. I think it was, you know, we get past till the 24th of August. We got back from pass, and on a lighter note, on the 4th of September, checking Andrew's notes, we had our company dance at 1 parachute battalion, which, you know, those kind of traditions you've got to admire, you know, just in terms of the traditional and historical value of that. And I remember there was a big discussion around girls, no girls, wives, no wives. And somehow, I don't know whether it was normal, but somebody had managed to convince somebody to go and invite one of the ladies' reses from what was it? COFSI's, University of Orange Free State. I'm not sure what it's called today. And anyway, they came, which was, yeah, I can only say that was an event in itself, because the last thing you want is a bunch of crazy paratroopers and women and booze. It's just a bad combination. But it was a lot of fun. Then 7th of September, we got orders, I think, on the 6th or 5th of September. 7th September, packed up, and 10 a.m. we left for Ndangwa. We got to Ndangwa and were immediately, we definitely knew we were involved in something else at that point in time. But I think what they wanted to do, if I think about it now, was get us into Ndangwa and then deploy us into, I can only assume, was a relatively safe area just for us to keep busy instead of hanging around camp, right? And they deployed us somewhere north of Oshikati. And the only thing I can remember about that is just miles and miles of nothing. I don't think there was any danger there, but supposedly we were to patrol and all sorts of stuff. But on the 19th of September, we were then, and I think at this point in time, Ops Firewood was well in advance. We didn't know it at the time, but we were involved in Firewood in some capacity or another. And we were then, on the 19th, we were rekitted and we were uplifted, and then we were flown by DAC at night to Iondi, which is about 120 kilometers inside Angola. And from the minute we arrived, we occupied that camp. It was just ourselves, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, 5 recce, with a VUS RSM of note, a recce RSM from 5 recce. I can't remember his name, but hell, it was a character of note. And so we occupied that Iondi, which really wasn't a base at all. It had an airstrip, and we were encamped, up on the side of the Shona, close enough to where the water was. What we did there was obviously all preparation for the ops that we were to take place in, which I can tell you a little bit. But really, it was high intensity training on ambush drills, small team patrolling, night patrols, huge emphasis on night stalking, night patrols, retraining on the claymores. Very specifically, the setup of the claymores. Once again, that's where all of that, all of that time spent, on all those basics at infantry school, you could just see that stuff. It was second knowledge. And then medical, emergency retraining, bandaging, drips, bullet hole procedures, all of that stuff. There was just a high emphasis on all of that. We were then very quickly told that we would be involved. One of our first ops, which was scheduled for, I think, the 25th of September, would be an ambush, and obviously we were in training for that. What was interesting is, every now and then we were resupplied by the DAC onto the airstrip, and just a funny story. The DAC. What would happen is, we'd be told the DAC was coming out, and then, I remember, being told one evening that we needed to go out and then we secure the airstrip. And what that meant was, we would go and then we would patrol around the airstrip to make sure that it was, I don't know, safe, or, that, there was, I don't know, just no imminent danger. And then what we would do is we would then have a flare. And, one person or 2 people would sit up at the top of the runway, 2 down the side, and then 1 at the back of the runway. And then at a certain time, we were given the signal, and then you'd light up the flare. And then the DAC would be circling, and then he would know, to come in, himself in the pitch black with no lights. And he would land on, on that, essentially on those flare indications, which was always interesting. One of the things, by the way, I think it was on, we were the second or third DAC had come in for a resupply, and we had a huge Qualification truck there with us, and we'd walked around the runway. We'd done a full sweep of the runway, come back around, and the Qualification had come up, and the Qualification had gone just off the runway, with the back, with its back tire, and boom, it hit an AP, which, I remember, I don't know. I mean, I remember, I think Bruce Passion, who was our LMG gunner said, I literally just walked there. You know, just shows how lucky it is. But obviously it needed that. It was either an AP or a mine. Possibly it was a mine, and it needed that extra pressure to detonate it. But, you know, I mean, I must say we were all quite surprised. You know, when it had been there, when it had been put there, we had no idea. But I'll tell you who was really irritated was the Quairfoil driver, because he was, yes, that's really dark. Didn't you see it? And anyway, because he had to sit and change that tire. And as you know, that was quite a job. While we were there, you know, seminal event, one of the seminal events that happened was, and I'm sure he won't mind me telling a story, was with Corporal Jacques Groenewald, who lost his hand, which was, it was just, we all, you know, even when we talk about it today, it was just a moment that caught everybody quite by surprise, because we were doing all that training and we were carrying all the claymores. As you know, for those of you that ever set up a claymore, you carry the debts, right? And what you would generally do is, or what I would always do is, I would put the debt inside polystyrene, and then I'd tape that debt tight, fast to the polystyrene, and then I'd put the debt, you know, the two debts in a very safe place, you know, in my bag, and then put the actual claymore itself, you know, in another section of the bag. And you know, I think we discussed, and Jacques had done the same thing. And in the middle of the night, I don't know, 10, 12 at night, unbeknownst to Jacques, is that the debt had come out. And when he pulled his sleeping bag out, or the spark on the sleeping bag, you know, ignited or electrified the debt. I'm not quite sure of the technical terminology. And that debt went off and literally blew Jacques' hand right off. And obviously, you know, a whole bunch of other injuries, I think, blew up, you know, literally in his hand. And I mean, it was just, yeah, it was quite a, it was just this huge explosion. No one knew what happened. And then you just heard Jacques, you know, shouting. Anyway, it was just a seminal moment for all of us, because you know, everyone just got a really big fright. And he was then casevaced out that night. And years later, you know, when he wrote to all of us and told us the story of that event, the casevac arriving, the recovery, you know, his parents coming to see him, you know what it must have been like, for moms and dads, right, of young boys, you know, and they did it resolutely. You know, South African parents, they sent their sons as they were instructed, right? So yeah, it was. I always remember reading that letter that he wrote and thinking, wow, you know, that's brave. But anyway, we then were ready for our first ambush, and we left Eondi on about the 24th of September, and we traveled north for, I don't know, 4-6 hours on those vehicles. I don't think it was the Buffels. I think we might have been on the Quairfoils or the Salmos. I'm not quite sure. We were dropped off that night. Late at night, we slept next to the vehicles, and then that very next morning, we set out to go and lay an ambush on that road. We were essentially walking to the road between Kuvalai and Chamotet, right? So we were on our way to go and lay an ambush there. I think we had, if I'm not mistaken, it was 5 days of walking to get in. I think 2 or 3 or 4 days to sit in ambush, and then planning for sort of 3 or 4 or 5 days to walk back out. What I do remember is, I remember a couple of things there, right? It was heavy going. There's no doubt about it, because you're carrying 14 days worth of kit. You've got first, second, third line ammunition. You also, you know, I don't know, radio or whatever other specialities or speciality weapons that everyone was carrying. Very specifically, the guys carrying an LMG and other weaponry. And you're carrying water, right? And you're carrying that water until such time as you realize, okay, there's water around that you can fill up your bottles. But we carried heavy. There's no doubt we carried heavy, and you know, that's where you realize all that fitness, and specifically your troops, right? You know, just no complaints, no issue, head down or head up and looking, but just up to the task. You know, we would do, I think, up to about 18 kilometers a day, which was quite heavy. We walked in an arrow formation, you know, on a compass bearing. And what I do remember is, you know, walking, you know, behind the point man on the arrow with the radio to, I think, the major or the captain, who was then directing direction, you know, from behind, you know, on the compass bearing, and then saying, no, push left, push right, push right. I do remember, you know, it's difficult to walk in position, in formation. That's number one. And it's difficult to maintain, you know, it's easy to walk in a straight line, you know, as a bunch of people, but it's difficult to walk in that arrow formation. And I remember that being quite taxing, very specifically with, you know, with all of that kit. The other thing that that we did, which I always thought was interesting, for the first, I think, 2 or 3 days on that walk, we had 2 recce operators with us. And hell, I remember just really taking my hat off to these guys. Really, there's a white guy and a black operator. And you know, when you're carrying those heavy kits, you know, it's tiring. You know, you walk for, I don't know, 1 or 2 Ks, rest, walk for, you know, there's a whole format that you follow. But, you know, when you stop, generally what you're doing is you sort of grabbing onto a tree, sliding down, sitting down, putting your backpack down, and rolling out of your kit because it's so heavy. But as much as we were carrying, I would say times 1.5, if not 2, is what those 2 recce operators were carrying. I could not believe it. You know, I would help, you know, at night, and when we closed up for a rest, you know, I would sit with the one operator at the back, and obviously I got chatting, and then I'd help him put on his kit. You know, to try and pick that kit up and put it on his back. And then I remember him, he'd steady himself, he'd lean over, you know, leaning over on his legs, and then he'd stand up, and then he'd start walking, and then he'd get his stride. And wow, you know, anyway, so they were with us for 2-3 days, and then they just peeled off and went onto what they were going to do. But a couple of things about, you know, one of the things I remember very clearly about talking to him, the guy had, they were both carrying AKs, right? And the AK that the white operator had, he'd sawn off the barrel. So he'd taken, I don't know, maybe about that much off the barrel. And I remember looking at that and saying to him, geez, you know, you can't hit a barn door with this thing. You know, you're never going to, he said, listen, I'm not here to, he said, if I hit a contact, it's at close quarters. And this rifle is absolutely perfect. He said, but ultimately I'm there to look and I'm there to move. He said, I'm not there necessarily to fight if I don't have to. My job is purely reconnaissance and get out of there. I'm not sure if this is true, but just out of interest, I heard that they got chased and they were compromised, and somebody said to me, that they were burnt out. They were chased by FAPLA or whoever it was, and they tried to burn them out by setting the felt alight. I mean, but unbelievable guys. I mean, I just really remember thinking, wow, this is a special kind of character. So, you know, we'd walked for, geez, I think we were nearing the target, actually. We'd walked for about 5 days. And on the 1st of October, 5, 6 days, I can't remember what it was. On the 1st of October, we'd gone down late afternoon. We'd gone down for a rest. It was late afternoon, maybe about 4 o'clock. We weren't going to move into the TB yet. And we hit a contact with a FAPLA patrol. And anyway, you know what it's like. Those contacts are so quick. And geez, it was like, once again, just a pack of dogs tearing down on this FAPLA patrol. Strangely enough, and how I don't know, but of the 5, 3 managed to get away. Essentially, we'd been split slightly. So I just remember hearing the late call on the major, get here now, and obviously we all charged down into this dip. There was a river, and these guys were camping up on the other side. I think about 500 meters from where we were originally. So it's, you know what those contacts are like, they're all quite chaotic. But what ended up happening was the two that we shot, one had been injured with shrapnel, because one of the guys had shot a snotneus, and the guy picked up some shrapnel in his head, and the other guy had been shot through the leg. And anyway, we got there, the two guys were lying there, the other guys had run. And of all the things that I do remember that I found amazing was we were looking at the food they were eating. To their rat packs, supposed rat packs, each couple of guys, they had salmon from the Nordics in little tins, and they had Dutch condensed milk and other chocolate specialities from Cuba. We were sitting looking at this, with our rat packs. The top end of it was those, what did we call them, a Vambo Pila. But anyway, that I remember that always struck me, because the guys were into the rat packs and obviously getting all that. So obviously we were now compromised, right, to a certain extent, and because the guys had run, and because we were close to target, we needed to get out of there as quick as possible. And if I remember correctly, the major took, we split up at that point in time, and the major took a bunch of guys to continue with the mission, if I'm not mistaken, to continue with that ambush. I stand to be corrected, but we split, and myself and my section with the Luti, my lieutenant was Lieutenant Maneki Schmidt, really, really nice guy. Actually, Uli Schmidt's younger brother, Uli Schmidt, the rugby player. And myself and Maneki's and one section had to take the wounded. And that, I got to tell you, in itself was an event, because we had to carry that wounded guy. They wanted these prisoners, they wanted them for intel, they wanted them for information. And we ended up carrying both of these guys immediately back out of there, and we walked for about 5-10 Ks in different directions. And Fapla then revved that area later that night. We could hear them revving that area. I don't know, they were dropping mortars or whatever it was, 81 mil mortars on the area that night. And so we carried those guys for that night, went down, and then for another 4 days thereafter, we carried that one guy that was shot in the leg. The other guy, turns out, was just a scrape. He'd had a nice carry for a night. And we wrapped him up with a bomverband, and he had, he tied his hands behind his back, and then, we led him around in front of us. And we carried those guys, or we carried that one guy for, I reckon it must have been 3 days. We walked to an RV where we were essentially picked up by the recce's, actually. Now, what was interesting was with that section, with myself and Maneki's and our section, we had 2 UNITA guys with us. And the thing that I'll never forget was the one UNITA guy had a which I'd never seen before, which they called a Portuguese patmore, which is, I think, a 60 mil or a 45 mil mortar. And what it is it's the pipe, and then it's got a band that allows you to wear this pipe on your chest, right? And that band is calibrated. So when you put that pipe down, you then put your front foot onto the calibration, and that's how you get your distancing right. And I'd never seen that before. And he could operate that thing on his own. And in his webbing, he had these mortars. To this day, I don't know whether it was 60 mil or whatever it was, but it was the most incredible looking weapon. And he'd wear these mortars here, and every time we stopped for a rest or went down, he'd take his stuff and he'd pack those mortars out, and they'd be in front of him, ready to go. Really, really good soldiers, and it was fascinating, fascinating to see. Funny enough, I'll tell you the story now. When I was eventually injured and ended up in hospital, but that guy that we carried, that we shot in the leg, I eventually ended up seeing in hospital about a month later. And there he was lying in bed with a great smile, sucking a fizz pop, and opened the drawer and offered me one of the big smile. It was absolutely bizarre. But so eventually, around about the 7th of, we eventually got out, walked these guys. We got picked up by the recce's, handed over the prisoners, and then we were shipped back. We drove back down to Yaoundé. At that point in time, the rain had started. The days were blazingly hot. Then between around about the 8th to the 29th of October, everything was prep and planning for Ops Firewood. Lectures, training. Admittedly, at that point in time, we didn't know exactly what was happening. And we weren't 100% quite sure. We didn't know what our level of involvement might be, but there was just a huge amount of planning, preparation, lectures, training, retraining, the normal story. And still, PT, typical, they would take us out and run us. So it was that, that overarching thing as a paratrooper, fitness, which was always prevalent. And what was interesting, at that point in time, we were then notified that the guys from Delta Company, would be in the direct attack, and we sent down from Charlie Company, Falk 1 and 2, to go and get trained up at Oshivelo. And so I think for most of that month of October, the guys were doing intense training on that camp attack, that Firewood camp attack, understanding the layout, working with, I think, definitely 101, and definitely working with the guys from 5 Recce, in preparation for that attack. We were still stuck running patrols and ambushes, etc., up at Yaoundé. And having talked to the major, or reading some of his comments, Major Skilly van der Walt, he said what we were doing up in that section, essentially in that sort of western portion, was diversionary tactics, trying to create as much noise and as much irritation as possible in prep for what was going to take place. We did a number of escorts for the recce's during that period in time, so there were a lot of teams going up. I think 2 and 4 man teams, and we did a lot of escorts and then collections of those recce's. Interestingly, we were then out of nowhere one day, we had to re-sign an act of secrecy document, which and I think the act of secrecy document was A, to say we're not in Angola, and B, to say we don't know anything about a camp or an attack or anything like that, for future reference. So I think the statute of limitation is over. So I'm happy to talk about it. So, which I found fascinating. There we were in the middle of the bush, all signing on each other's backs, this act of secrecy, which, you really didn't have any choice to whether you signed or not. But yeah, so it was just an extended period up there up until the 29th. One of the things I do remember, and to his everlasting skill set, was Staff Gruber actually killed a black mamba at night with a spade that had crawled right up next to him or next to somebody else. I mean, it was it was a over 2 meter long black mamba, which was just absolutely bizarre. Then on the 28th of October, the full Firewood convoy arrived, and that was quite a scene. to see. And I think you've had a couple of guys on the channel that have talked through that, but 167 vehicles, if I'm not mistaken, I think is the count that I remember. That convoy was I don't know, 16 to 18 to 20 kilometers long. Just a massive column of superior military, vehicle and expertise. We were still unsure as to what our role would be. Myself and my folk, we weren't quite sure. But we obviously were aware then of the high level of training that the Delta guys and our two folks had been through. Okay, so then on the 29th of October, we departed for Shillongo, which was, I guess, one of the initial staging areas, pre the camp attack, or pre the commencement of Ops Firewood, right? Convoys had started to go all day, and it was cool to see just that immense convoy of 101 battalion vehicles. Obviously, a big force in terms of what looked like a big force in terms of Caspers. Magnificent, big 5.0 Brownings mounted on the top, and then also there were the 81 mil. I think the 81 mil Rattles, if I'm not mistaken. What was interesting was, unbeknownst to me at the time, was two guys that I'd been at infantry school with were with 101 and were on the same attack. Chris Neyman, who's still a good friend to this day, was integrally involved in that attack and was, in a vehicle in 101, and Chris, who was an instructor as well, and then Dave Bock, who actually was a 1 Purpaloot, who'd been with us at infantry school and who ended up winning the Honoris Crux on that camp attack. If you read up, you can read about his story, which I always thought was incredible, but also just a quiet, unassuming, if I'm not mistaken, came from Northern Natal, exemplary bravery. I think if I stand to be corrected, I think he was caught in an ambush, and a bunch of his troops exited the vehicle, and he stayed with the vehicle and defended himself and whatever was left. I think there was 1 or 2 injured. He stayed on the top on that turret with that 5.0 Browning, just fending off, an ambush that was taking place, an ancillary event taking place alongside that camp attack. But so that was unbeknownst. And then obviously, a couple of mates that we'd been together at infantry school were with Delta Company in that attack. So we then got to Shillongo. We got to that staging area, as I think about 9 hours of driving. As I mentioned to you before, we left at about 4 o'clock. We got to Shillongo at about 4 o'clock in the morning. That's 9 hours in that biffle. You heard the other guys talk about Firewood, and wow, that is hard riding in a biffle. It's you're just riding in dust, and that biffle is shaking, and it's not, you're not sitting down strapped. I'm sitting on the seat. You are standing on the seat, sometimes sitting down, but in most instances, what we would do is we would stand on the seat and hold the roll bar and then ride it, just to be able to deal with it, because it's nonstop. I mean, imagine that, it's 9 hours. Anyway, just that part of it, right? So we got to Shillongo. I remember waking up early that morning, and so I think I mentioned there were 3 things that really stood out for me that day. The first of which was I was sent on a water patrol, and I remember walking down, and I saw who I thought, and I now understand, was part of the planning for this attack, was Chris Schulenberg, who, and I'm convinced it was him, and somebody can tell me it wasn't him, but I do know from other information that he was involved in that, in the planning of the attack. Whether or not he'd done the recon, I don't know. And Chris Schulenberg was ex-South African, ex-Rhodesian SAS, ex-Rhodesian Selous Scout, who was, you know, the highest award, I think is it the Gold Cross, Bronze Cross? I can't remember, of Rhodesia. A supreme soldier who was probably the pioneer or #1 exponent of small teams operating, you know, long range recon, you know, is I think acknowledged the world over as probably the leading exponent of long range recon and small teams recon. That was #1. #2, I remember, I don't know why this, you know, I remember coming through, going down to the river and walking past a bush and moving to the side to get past it, and there was a boomslang. It was just a surreal experience. I don't know why, but I just remember that. And then #3, I went and saw Nico Olivier, who was an instructor and a platoon sergeant like myself. And I think he was sitting there. We were lying on the top of the Quairfloor chatting. He was with Rainier Kruger, if I'm not mistaken, who was a Luti. And I remember chatting to Nico because obviously we'd been together. And, you know, he was with Delta Company. And I remember him saying, oh, you know, he was saying, I'm feeling nervous about it. Because generally, you know, everyone's just so gung-ho. And I remember Nico saying, I'm just feeling nervous. And sometimes you just think, in these situations, sometimes people have a premonition. I don't know, but Nico was actually to lose his life the next day in that attack. He was, you know, one of a number of paratroopers that were killed that day. So we were then. I remember actually one of the recce's telling us this is the furthest a Biffle has ever been into Angola, but actually we felt it. I mean, you know, those journeys on those Biffles, you know, it could shake your teeth loose, right? But we ended up, our Falk, 2 Falks of ours, we ended up, you know, protecting the support group. We were, I don't know how far, maybe a kilometer away from the actual camp attack. You know, we heard it going off, which lasted well into the day. And then, you know, late afternoon was the commencement of the extraction. I'm not going to talk about the actual attack because I think you've had a bunch of guys on there that have talked about it, that were real front and center in there. So, you know, and if you're looking for any other guys to come and talk about it, you know, I would suggest getting hold of 1 or 2 of the Delta guys, you know, the Delta bats. Delta was to lose 6 men that day in that attack, and 2 of our Charlie Company guys were injured in that attack. In some respects, I think that the attack was a success. In other instances, some people say it's a failure. I think it's highly contentious at this point in time, but from what I've heard, good or bad, some people say the Air Force delivered an underpowered airstrike that nearly took out some of our own forces. What I do know, which I think is pretty factual, is that the battle formation was formed up slightly incorrectly. And the Parabats, primarily our 2 Falks and Delta, which were on the right-hand flank, actually ended up going through the middle of the base, which and I think that what actually happened in that attack, they got into the middle, got bogged down the trenches. I mean, I think there was fire pre even getting to the camp. And then I think the attack had to reform and re-go through. Meanwhile, you know, what was happening was, you know, there was, you know, multiple other battles that were going on in and around that camp, and I know the 101 battalion guys were deeply involved in that. I mean, you've obviously heard that wonderful story of the 101 guys going late into the day, going back up the road to turn right towards the camp, and a truck full of Vapler and I think Swapper coming down from the north and turning into the convoy, which, yeah, I mean, which I think is just it's a great story. Obviously, they were quickly taken out, but yeah, I mean, it was honestly just a really crazy day. You know, just in terms of even just being that close to it and in the lead up to it, you know, and on standby from a support perspective at all, you know, waiting, and then obviously the extraction. Extraction was late at night in pitch black, which you know, takes quite a bit of coordination to move that volume, you know, back out of that environment. And as you know, or as you might have heard, you know, the big threat was the MiGs, and the big threat, well, in our minds, from what we were told, were those stolen organs, which you know, were potentially or supposedly able to deploy pretty quickly. So that really it was on everyone's mind. But early morning on the 1st of November, we drove straight through the night, you know, on the 31st, and then early morning on the 1st of November. I don't know how many hours we've been driving for, but we stopped and we went to ground, primarily because there'd been a report that the MiGs were scrambling and that there'd been some stolen organs. Now, I think they re-revved that area. I'm not sure. I can't really remember, but somebody else will have a little bit more information. So we needed to get out of there, and then we needed to go to ground and dig in. You know, we heard the bombing and the strafing later that afternoon, which was obviously evident, right? And then the major then asked me to go and meet the chopper, take a section and go and meet the chopper, who was there to Casabac, the deceased. You know, we drove out, got hold of the Quairful, you know, where the 6 paratroopers were in, and the chopper came in, and you know, I mean, not a great experience, just purely because you know, it was at that point in time, you know, just purely from a personal perspective, I saw Nico, who I had no idea had been shot and killed, and it you know, really took me back. Plus the other boys, and the chopper came in. He didn't land. He hovered above the Quairful, which was, you know, quite a scene in itself. Just they were hovering above the Quairful. We were on top of the Quairful, and we were trying to load the boys, you know, the deceased into the vehicle, which, you know, in itself, I think, you know, was just not great in any shape or form. And I know you know, we've all spoken about it subsequently. It just wasn't great. But I mean, it was good to make sure that those boys, you know, one of whom I'd had some level of connection with, was, you know, loaded and on their way back home, you know, for all the respect that they deserved. We then left that evening, the night of the 1st, and drove again through the night, and arrived back in Shilongo, and dug in once again, you know, in the event that there was any any danger. We were then, for some strange reason, instructed to head out to a spot about 40 kilometers away and set up for an ambush, which was done, but there was subsequently no kills. No one walked into the ambush. And then the other thing I do remember is on the 6th of November, and I wasn't sure the dates until I checked Andrew's notes, we were asked to prepare an LZ for 2 Pumas that were inbound, 2 Puma choppers that were inbound. And General Liebenberg was on one of the choppers. I believe, I can't remember who else, but I know that General Liebenberg was on there, and he spoke to Colonel Hills, and I know our Major Van der Walt was also inside that chopper. And I think it was just about context and what to do next. I remember it raining nonstop that entire evening, nonstop. And the other thing I do remember is being called over by the Major to collect a crate of beers that obviously the General had brought up for the boys. It's always those small things that you remember. The other thing I remember about that night is a fuel tanker had rolled off a ridge, and the Major said to us, right, just stay and guard this fuel tank, which we did for the whole night in that driving, pouring rain, which was crazy. On the 9th of November, we left Shilongo, heading for Iondi, all the way back to Iondi again. Admittedly, it felt good, going south, even if it was in a biffle, which at that point in time we were mad about. I think we got there on the 10th and kept going. We didn't stop and hang around in Iondi. We headed immediately south for the cut line. To try and hit those 120 k's that we had to 100 kilometers that we had to do to the cut line. Here's the interesting thing: it was about 7.5 hours of bundu bashing, okay, which is once again insane. Two of our sections from two of our folks stayed behind at Iondi. They were told to wait there and stay behind and protect the airstrip and assist 101 battalion, who were actually still doing ops in the area, interestingly enough. We drove once again from the 10th all the way through the night, and on the 11th we were about 60 kilometers away from the cut line and in a convoy, it was discovered that we had two tankers of avgas too many, and that those tankers had to go back to Iondi. And we were then told, right, turn around, you guys need to escort these tankers back up to Iondi, which we did in record time, which was 5 hours of rebundu bashing again on those buffles, and then turned around at Iondi and then headed back south again, drove through the night, just beat our way through the cut line and pushed on to Ondangwa. And we got to Ondangwa 18 hours later after 300 kilometers of bundu bashing, which was, Anyway, we then, got to Ondangwa, in fact, bizarrely, we got there 4 a.m. and then had to camp outside. We couldn't go into base at that time. And then, it was a bit of relaxing, etc., etc. That's where that one photo I'm standing next to Staff Kreber that I sent you, Fossi. You can see, you can just see the wear and tear in my humble opinion. Just that personal wear and tear. It's been a long haul. Then what they did was they gave us a few days off. We thought, okay, well, things are looking pretty relaxed. They gave us a few days off, and we heard, between that return, which would have then been on, arriving on Ondangwa 12th, we sort of had off, got ourselves cleaned up, got ourselves sorted out, back into camp routine, once again, PT always. And then we were redeployed on the 18th. So, it was a short little breather, and they deployed us then back into Angola, and they deployed us northeast of Ongiva. Now, for those that will remember, Ongiva, I think 3-4 years before 85 had been a South African base, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know, I'm not 100% sure of my history, but I know that we occupied Ongiva at one point in time. But at that point in time, when we were deployed northeast of Ongiva, We were deployed supposedly for 3 weeks. And at that point in time, sitting in on Jiva was an occupying FAPLA force of about 800. And I believe about 70 odd were in that base. And so our role on that deployment up in the northeast there was very specifically to, number one, irritate, number two, draw them out. Obviously, pull them out for as many contacts as we can. And number three, look for suitable spots for an 81mm mortar attack on the base. That was the role. So we had to, we were in I think we were Falk strength, if I'm not mistaken. And that was the role, right? And so, they dropped us off there around about the 19th, and then we had to walk up to where we were going to deploy from. We were a small force, essentially. So we were looking to try and be as specific as possible in terms of our grid referencing and where we needed to be on the, on the map. So we worked in that area the 19th, 20th, on the 22nd. I think on the 20th, there was a small contact, but a nondescript contact. I think it's just one of those shoot and scoot and run type events. But we were right next to the base. I would say, I don't know, less than a kilometer, maybe less, maybe more, operating up in that area there. On the 22nd, we heard vehicles that were really close. And we discussed whether or not to engage the vehicles. We didn't know what vehicle strength it was. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Captain Duplessis decided, listen, that's not worth it, because A, we don't know what strength and what type of vehicles they are, number one, and also we had a small size, and then we were worried about them being able to cut off our escape route, which obviously needed to be in a southerly direction, right? Unless we just ran north. So we then decided we moved west, and then we started to move a little south just to go and test a new area. The idea being to let them know we were there and draw them out. So, get in as close as possible. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Lieutenant Sinclair even started walking up the main road. As you know, there was a tar road that ran right up into that base, and I think they got revved with some mortars. But we then moved further south, finding better mortar positions, and then on the 24th of November, we moved south to go and rendezvous with the vehicles, right? And as we were moving south, we hit our next contact. And, that was quite an interesting contact, because what had happened was we were two sections. We'd come out of the bush line, and in front of us in the bush line was sort of a long running, thin-ish shona, about 100 meters in length. And I'd taken the one section across, and the captain and I think one of the lieutenants had stayed on the other side of the shona, and we'd gone down just inside the bush line. And I remember we were leaning up against a tree, we'd gone down for a rest, and all I remember is, I think it was the lieutenant said, just heard on the radio, obviously in Afrikaans, hey, there's a couple of guys coming up the shona on bicycles, shoot them. That's how close we were. They were coming riding up the shona on their bicycles. I think the one guy even had a radio playing. Anyway, obviously the guys started shooting, and the two guys were taken out, but not before. All I could think of when this contact was going on was, we are shooting, and fortunately it was an incline on the other side, but our other section was on the other side. And the other interesting thing is that what had happened was the guy had an SKS rifle, and he had an SKS anti-tank grenade, and he managed to pull that off, one of the guys, and that SKS grenade landed about 5 meters from a couple of us. And I remember feeling the impact and then looking at it afterwards and going, "Gee, no, that was close," you know, and because it just pegged into the sand. And so after that, you know, we cleaned up, mopped up, etc. And then we headed south, and we moved down to the tar road between Omapanda and Namakundi, where we were going to go and get resupplied. And then we met up with the vehicles who had the 81mm mortars. And then we got into the vehicles, and we then started to head out late evening. Now, myself and one of the sections, we were second in line in the convoy, and we were riding on that road for a little bit, or we'd come on and off that road. It wasn't a tar road, but it was quite a hard road. Then we'd come off it. And what happened was, at one point in time, we arrived, and there was a sort of a two-spur pikey, and we got onto that two-spur pikey. And as I say, we were the second vehicle in the convoy, and we hit the landmine, and it was just the most unbelievable experience, and not to be repeated. But all of us that were in that biffle, you know, I think I've sent you the photos if you want to if you put them up at some point in time. But actually, that it was a TMA double cheese mine, according to the mechanics that went to go and pick it up. But what it actually did was it blew that biffle, that it went straight up into the air and then landed on its bin in the hole, which is an almighty blast. Now, we were incredibly lucky, all of us, to survive that. Number one, I was standing at the time on the seat holding the roll bar and talking to the driver when that landmine detonated. I shot straight up into the air and ended up landing down in front of the vehicle. I mean, I'd love to have seen myself in a slow-mo movie flying through the air. It must have been fantastic. The other guys that had been sitting on the bin or were also standing on the seats holding onto the roll bar were none of them catapulted out, but a bunch of them fell into the back and into the hole underneath where the bin was. And how that vehicle didn't roll back onto all of those guys and injure people seriously, I absolutely do not know. So yeah, I mean, and as you know, for anyone who's been in a landmine, you know, it's disconcerting. There's no doubt about it. I know that the guys all went into immediate drills, you know, expecting an ambush, but you actually can't hear anything. Your eardrums are immediately perforated. You generally are quite disorientated. There's no doubt about it. I mean, if you're going to ambush somebody, ideally do it to the mine first. Is clearly what I've understood. So that was quite interesting. And I was immediately casevaced out, myself and a couple of other guys that had some dings, etc. And the rest of the guys went on to go and rev on Jiva with the 81mm. I was pushed back down with a couple of the other guys down to Ndangwa, and then you know, ended up in hospital. And then I saw the guys about 2 days later. And then what was interesting there was on my way out of the vehicle, on exiting, I'd obviously banged the roll bar and, I don't know, the back of the turret, and I had these open wounds on my legs, you know, where I'd taken, you know, beating. And unbeknownst to me as well, I had pretty much shredded all the ligaments in my left knee. And that was the sum total of my injuries. The rest of the guys had sort of dings and bangs and sprains, etc. Yeah, back at Ndangwa, and I was in hospital for a couple of days. Ended up seeing, as I said, that guy that we shot all those months before, that Fapla guy that we shot. He was lying in bed having the greatest time. So happy to be, you know, a South African prisoner. And I, you know, they sort of, you know, treated my wounds a little bit and then put a cast on my leg and then sent me back to camp. I remember with the crutches going down the airstrip all the way back, got back to camp, and just a day later, I was just in agony. They didn't know that I'd shot all my ligaments by then. I went back, they looked at me again. They said, "No, you're fine. You're just irritated. Take these tablets." I went back, and eventually, it was a commandant doctor there who cut off the cast, and my leg was just had swelled up radically. And then he said, "Listen, I think I'm going to send you home." Which he did. And interestingly, by then, that was around about, end of November, and we were due to claw out on the 18th of December. Anyway, and I was shipped down to 1 Mil, which wasn't a great place. That December 87, there were a lot of injuries, a lot of boys coming in that had been injured, etc., etc., etc. I was operated on, and then they sent me to the old 1 Mil for recovery. And I got in there. I spent a night or two in there, and I said, "Right, I'm out of here. I want to go back to the unit. I want to go and claw out with my guys," which I did, and then finished up, and that was it. It was just, it rounded off a really, really great year and a great experience, through and through. And yeah, eventually that December, I went on holiday, went camping in the Transkei, with that cast. Eventually pulled the cast off, wrapped a bandage, just to try and recover, which I did really quickly. Came back up to Johannesburg, and back to my story, went to go and chat to my father again about university. And he said, his words to me were, "What did I tell you 2 years ago? You're not university material." He said, "Listen, how much money have you got?" I said, "I actually have no idea." Because, you got your pay book. It wasn't, you couldn't log into an app, right? And I had danger pay, rank pay, jump pay, I can't remember, and so the money just accumulated and you didn't spend the money. And anyway, I got my pay book, had a look, and I said, "Oh, quite a bit of money." He said, "Right, now take that money and go overseas and go and have a holiday and work, and don't come back for 2 years." He says, "If you run out of money, phone us. You might not get it, but phone us." He said, "And go and have a good time." And he was true to his word. After that, subsequently, I started to, study and do various things, but he was brutally aware that period of time was, right, go and experience that. Now that you've experienced that, go and have a break and have a great time. And which was also great, by the way. Just traveled and worked around. And for those guys that have got young kids that haven't done that, I would strongly advise them to do that, and see the world and bum around and work and etc., etc. So guys, yeah, that's my story. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for letting me tell the story. Hopefully there's some bits and pieces of information that help other things piece together, or certainly information about Firewood, what it was like from another angle, and also what it was like as a national serviceman, and very much what it was like being a paratrooper, which to this day I'm really, really proud of, and love the fact that I was a paratrooper, and we still have a strong connection, all of us, both my infantry school crowd and also our Charlie Company crowd. In fact, I think we got a reunion next week in Cape Town. So Posse, thank you. Nice to meet you guys, and much appreciated.
Only a pleasure. And yes, folk, if you want to come tell your story, the email address is below here, going past now. Just before I let you go, did you continue jumping, or was it only the military jumps?
Oh, I jumped a couple of times afterwards, which was really, really interesting. And then for a while, once I moved to Cape Town, we did paragliding. That's where you sort of jump off the side of the mountain in a highly steerable chute, which was a lot of fun. We had there was a bunch of mates that we all did it together, and yeah, we had a lot of fun doing that. So yeah, but not Yeah, not ongoing. Just by the way, one of the first places I went to when I traveled was to Israel, because I met a guy in Pretoria who'd been an Israeli Parabat, funny enough, during my time in service, and ended up in Israel working for nearly a year in various odd jobs on boats and at a horse farm, and all for ex-Israeli paratroopers.
Okay, they understood you. Yeah,
they understood, and they realized, right, here's a guy, this guy can. And by the way, if you ever worked for an Israeli, an old school military Israeli, you work. Those guys had me cleaning the underneath of boats and up at 4 a.m. cleaning the horse stables, but a lot of fun. Yeah, a lot of fun. But once again, paratroopers.
Yeah, you see, there's a day on the same level. Mentally, you're on the same level. I sat here with visions while you were mentioning the recce's and the way they operated. You must go and watch, especially SW Fourie. I don't know if you watched these. He was the first series. The amount of the stuff that they did, and always jumped at night, 800, 600 foot. Full packs, and he actually, while you were describing jumping with your full kit, he told of one jump that they went into, one deployment. He lost his pack somehow along the line, and he had to share rats and the likes. But this mental image is burnt into my mind. You know where the aloe hanger was at Ondangs? Yes. I mean, I don't know how often we walked past you, bats lining up for jumps, and then you mentioned lunar ops. Oh my soul! I'll never forget one. I think we were firing down. We were shooting. We were in orbit, and the dat flippin' bumbled right through our arc of fire. But okay, we weren't firing because there was quite good coordination, and one of you bats tossed a grenade into a kraal, and the next thing, the whole kraal was on fire. And we actually had your commander in the chopper with us, and he went ballistic. He was,
I'm sure,
down at whoever was running the show on the ground. How can you put out a bushfire in the middle of a kraal, that dry wood? I mean, it was crazy. These are all memories that keep coming. We used to walk past, Malvleis bomber. There they go again.
I know. But you realize just what a highly efficient, highly structured, highly organized military army it was, just from equipment to training to personnel. I mean, it certainly was a place to be proud of, and I hope there's remnants of it still that still exist today.
Yeah, and the one thing that also struck me with chatting with you or listening to you chat is you went to the army mentally prepared. You were ready mentally. You were gonna have a good time. I've heard so many guys say they went there with apprehensive and they didn't know what to do and they were scared and they didn't enjoy it and they this and that. But you, I think everything you said was, I'm going there to enjoy it. I'm going to have fun. And my father told me he's not going to waste his money on university. So go and have fun, son. And that was
fun.
Great.
Well, amazing that the South African Army could give you that. You just had to deal with, a little bit of the discipline and
a little bit.
But apart from that, a tiny bit of discipline.
Just a little bit, and a bietjie afkak, net bietjie afkak.
Tiny bit.
Anyway,
all right, Fossie.
We've been at it for a while, so I'm going to say to you, Simon, I thank you sincerely. Bring the buddies, let them come and chat with us. We haven't had many Parabats. Well, you're at ground level Parabats, let's say.
Yes, okay.
We've had the odd commanders come and chat, and the guys have done parachute training come and chat. But it's great to hear your story from your side of where you were, and most enjoyable this was. I would like to thank you, and I'd also like to say, until we meet again, Internet, God bless.
Thank you.